This seems familiar, doesn't it? We appreciate your presence this evening and your endurance. I think the age of the earth is an absolutely critical issue in the creation-evolution controversy, and I'm somewhat disturbed sometimes when we hear even brethren saying this is a part of the controversy that's really not that important. I find that's often the case when they have compromised their faith in what the Word of God says on the subject, about what the Word of God teaches on this subject from time to time, but that's not what we're doing tonight. I think the Bible does speak to the issue, but we're looking this evening at what science tells us on the subject of the age of the earth. And many scientists, of course, tell us the earth is billions of years old. Is it young or in the area of science? I don't think it's old at all. And I think the best scientific explanation would reach that conclusion. We're told it's something, well, you have a rather wide range, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 billion, 4.75 to 5 billion years, the age of the earth. And it's interesting to see how that has evolved. Henry Morris says when he went to school it was only 3 billion years old, which tells you how long ago he went to school. This is converged and confirmed it was 3 billion years. Now then they all confirm, but at a different spot, converge. This is absolutely essential, of course, for the naturalist and for the evolutionist. I think it's essential for someone that believes in the Bible that it's young. But if you're going to believe in evolution and naturalistic origins, then you must have billions and billions of years. Badash, professor of history of science, University of California at Santa Barbara, he says, 4.5 billion years ago, the primal Earth emerged from a spinning turbulent cloud of gas, dust, and planetoids that surrounds the new star. On these figures for the age of the Earth rest all of geology and evolution. This is the foundation. Without this, the whole thing crumbles. I think that's absolutely true. And I think it does crumble because that is not scientific conclusion. To understand the role that evolution plays in the thinking of the evolutionists, notice this is a Nobel laureate. He's talking about the origin of life, and as he evaluates it, as we did in the previous session, and sees the complexity, the interdependent complexity, irreducible complexity, hundreds of thousands of pages of the encyclopedia worth of information. He says, this is impossible. That's what he said. That's the term he uses. One only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet, here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. That is, it happened naturally. It's impossible, but I believe the impossible. How does he do that? However improbable we regard this event or any of the steps which it involves, given enough time, it will almost certainly happen at least once. Time is, in fact, the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible, probable, the probable virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. Now that's, I don't think, a very scientific statement, but this is the way they think. Now I know a little bit about the effect of us as we get older can look in the mirror and see that time is not helping us a whole lot. It's not really organizing things, is it? And you see that in the natural world. You buy a new car, and the longer you keep it, the more powerful and shinier it gets. No, it doesn't work that way, does it? You see the smoke come up from the campfire, and if you wait long enough, that smoke comes together and organizes. No, time spreads it out, dissipates it, disorganizes. Time doesn't have an organizing characteristic in it. If anything, the opposite. That's the effect. We're skipping that lecture, but we have one that deals with that. But this, as someone has suggested, is the Holy Spirit of the evolutionist. It solves all the problems. It's the miracle-working power. I don't think time has that power. We read princes who kissed the frog and it turned into the prince. And we're told that's a fairy tale, but actually in the universities across the country, that story is revised and it is not a fairy tale. When you wave the wand of time, it becomes science. And it's real. It just took millions of years. And the impossible happens. By the way, do you know how long it takes an evolutionist to change a light bulb? Doesn't take any, it just happens. But it takes millions of years. This is what passes for science. And I think, while they try to ridicule, I think it's ridiculous. In the other direction, this is not science. Yes, the frog turned into the prince. As long as you take millions of years, this is science, and we're spending billions of years to teach our students this. I think the effect of time is the opposite. I like to ask why questions. We hear over and over and over again that the earth is billions of years old, usually without any argumentation at all. It's just asserted. You open the little dinosaur books, the golden books, millions and millions of years ago, when you read about the dinosaurs. Why do you think that? Why do people think? And a lot of them don't think why, but that's a good scientific question, a good starting place. Why? And when we ask that question, usually the first response we get involves radiometric dating. They've dated these rocks, and the rocks are billions of years old, and so obviously the earth has to be that old. And of course you understand how radioactive dating works and know how to evaluate that, right? Well, most people don't have a clue, any idea at all what radiometric dating is about. This is a response that we get, but they don't understand the process in a way that can be evaluated. It reminds me of the time we announced this subject, radioactive dating, and some of the teenagers got the wrong idea about what we were going to be talking about. Now, and we won't go into a long lecture about radioactivity, but we'll just look at some of the basics here where you can get a general picture of it. Radioactive material is material that emits alpha and beta particles from the nucleus of the atom. And as it does that, it becomes something different. It decays into different elements by emitting these particles. That's what registers on your Geiger counter when you see the movies and they're hunting for the radiation. These little alpha and beta particles are being emitted. And it's supposed to tell time something like an hourglass. Now, if you look at the hourglass and you know that it takes an hour for the sand at the top to run down to the bottom, how much time has transpired here? Well, you can look at that and get a pretty good estimate. You can say maybe 12, 15 minutes has transpired, and if you could count the grains of sand, you could come up with a real good estimate of how much time was involved, couldn't you? But what could go wrong with that kind of an estimate? What are the pitfalls here? Well, suppose just before you looked, somebody lifted the lid at the top and dumped in a lot of extra sand that skewed the picture. That'd mess it up, wouldn't it? Maybe an hour had transpired almost, and now then you got a lot of extra that throws it off. Or just before you look, somebody lowers the bottom and lets out most of what's already down there. That would mess it up. Or suppose just before you look, and it's side exactly like this, virtually, and then they set it up, and then you look, and the answer is really 10 seconds. And you say 15 minutes. You've got to know the beginning conditions. You've got to know that nothing was added at the top and nothing was let out or escaped at the bottom. It has to be a closed system in order to tell time. And if any of those things are not accurate, obviously it's not going to tell time. And this analogy provides a good illustration of what's wrong with the radiometric dating systems. With uranium-238, you see a decay process through a series of elements, finally down to lead, which is stable, which is 206. So it loses 32 particles emitted as it comes down from 238 down to 206. And if you know how long that takes, and you see the relative amounts top and bottom, and nothing's leaked in and leaked out, and you know the beginning conditions, but we know lead occurs naturally as well as radiogenically, and so you have to guess at how much lead was there to start with. And if you guess at any step along the way, you might as well guess at the answer to start with, which is basically what's involved. This is the formula that allows, we won't go into the detail, but that's how the system is supposed to work. Notice the statement by Henry Fall, one of the leading authorities, geochronologist, in his book Ages of Rocks, Planets, and Stars. He says two important assumptions are implicit in this equation. First, that we're dealing with a closed system. In other words, nothing leaked in, nothing leaked out. If you're familiar with rocks, you know a little bit about petrification. Things get petrified sometimes. How does that happen? Well, water percolates down through here and it takes out some of the bone material and replaces it with other stuff. So some gets taken out and some gets... The very fact of fossilization shows that you don't have closed systems in rocks usually, as he goes on to say. Second, that no atoms of the daughter, that's what's produced at the bottom, in the case we showed you, lead, were present in the system when it formed. And we know lots of lead is present naturally. These assumptions furnish the most serious limitations on the accumulation clock. Now, he is a devotee of the system, one of the leading experts. But those are serious limitations. He says rigorously closed systems probably do not exist in nature. Rocks are not sealed off, are they? Water percolates down through there and carries minerals in and leaches material out. Surprisingly, though, he says many minerals in rocks satisfy the requirement well enough to be useful for nuclear age determination. The problem is one of judicious geologic selection. So this is not an objective process. They get to select what they want and chuck what they don't want. And that's the way the process works. Mauger of East Carolina University, writing in the journal Contributions to Geology, says in general, dates in the correct ballpark are assumed to be correct and published. But those in disagreement with the data are seldom published, nor are the discrepancies fully explained. It just comes out wrong, you chuck it. And they do more chucking than they do accepting. And you just keep chucking until you get the, quote, right answer, which is not science at all. You're just playing a game to confirm what you assume. A good exercise that I give some of my students sometimes on the internet, the carbon-14 labs or the thermoluminescent lab, which we're using in Connecticut this week, or the potassium-argon labs, uranium-thorium, lead, any of the radiometric dating labs, and look at the form that you submit with your sample, which will usually be on the internet. When you submit the form, you have to tell them where it came from, what the age of the rock is, and what the predicted age. In other words, they've got to know the answers before they take the test, or they won't take the test. Now, in science, when you do testing, you often do double-blind tests where you don't know the answer at all. That's the best, that's the only way you have a real scientific test. This is just the opposite. They've got to know all the answers or they won't take the test. And if it doesn't come out the way they expect it, they chuck it. The discrepancies they don't attempt to explain. Of course, the simple explanation is something leaked in and something leaked out, and yeah, well, we know to object to. An example of this kind of problem is given in the book Bones of Contention by Roger Lewin. He's editor of Research News and Science magazine. Has worked together with Richard Leakey, one of the more famous paleoanthropologists. And this regards the 1470 skull, a very famous skull. We'll talk briefly about it, I think, Tuesday evening. How do you know how old it is? Well, that's the whole ball game in determining whether it's significant or not. If the fellow died last week, then you don't get famous for finding a skull, do you? It has to be old. Well, he says the calculated age was quickly refined to 2.61 plus or minus 0.26 million years. Now, this is the editor of Research News describing this. which to anthropologists unfamiliar with the procedures of radiometric dating has a ring of comforting precision about it. Now, even some of the anthropologists don't know how this works, so don't feel bad if you don't understand. It sounds good, 2.61 plus or minus 0.26 million years. Yeah, that sounds very, very precise, doesn't it? Then he says, let's look at what really went on here. He says there were 41 separate age determinations. Now, this is a fellow who's a proponent of the system, firmly believes in it. But there were 41 separate age determinations which varied between 223 million and less than 1, 0.91. Now, less than 1 to 223 million is a huge variation. After the first determination, they never again obtained the 2.61 from their experiments. They got that once out of 41 tries, but that's what they wanted, and so that's what they published. And it sounded very precise. But the dates were all over the place. Now, this is from their description of what went on, and so yes, to anthropologists unfamiliar, it sounds precise. To the ones who are familiar, they just sort of say, yeah, okay. But it's again confirm their conclusions. There are times, though, when we can, at least relatively, know what ought to be the answer and what ought not to be, which provides somewhat of a test. We're looking here. You see the layers up on top. These are horizontal layers. I think they were, with billions of dead things in them, I think they were laid down by the flood. But under that, down in the inner part of the gorge, you see the igneous rock. I think these were created originally and then some fire formed, deformed, metamorphized. But as you look at this, and especially at this lava that flowed over the edge, the volcanic material that's here in white, is that younger or older than the rocks down in the bottom of the canyon, according to the evolutionary view of the origin of these rocks? Well, obviously, the oldest rocks would be down toward the bottom, that the sedimentary rocks were laid on top of. And then the youngest would be this volcanic material that spews out at the top, that some have said probably the American Indians saw form. Well, interestingly, the Cardenas lavas that we have the arrow pointing to down toward the bottom is exactly the same kind of rock that we see flowing over the edge. It's volcanic material. Well, let's send these to a dating lab, not tell them where it came from, and that's not easy to do. I won't tell you how that happened. I didn't do it, and I don't think I could have, but anyway, it was done. And see what the answers turn out to be. And actually, it was sent to a number of different labs using a number of different methods. Potassium argon, rubidium strontium, lead. Here, the rocks up at the top, the youngest, 17 million years for potassium argon, all the way to 2.6 billion years for lead. Same rock, using a different method. Now, 17 million to 2.6 billion, or 2,600 million, is a huge, but that's what happens when you use different methods on the same rock. But that's what's supposed to be the youngest, 2.6 billion. You try that then on the one down at the bottom, and you only the same method, rubidium strontium isochron, and you get just over 1 billion. The one up top is more than twice as old, according to the same dating system. And so you get a wide range of dates depending on what dating system you used, and then when you use the same dating system, the one that's supposed to be youngest turns out to be oldest. This is not supposed to be younger down at the bottom, but that's what you see. Now, these you would chuck because they didn't come out right, and you'd try again until you may have to try 41 times you get the right answer. But that's the way the game is played. When it is testable, I think you can demonstrate that it fails. It's not dependable when you're dealing with these millions of years. We did a test with Mount St. Helens in the caldera. Now, this originally erupted in 1980, but what's in the caldera, this dome in the center, most of that was erupted in 1986. And shortly after that, I think 89 was when this test was performed, we took samples from this dome in the center. Now, we know about how old this rock is. At the time this was done, it was about 11 years old. And we sent it to the labs, knowing the origin. Well, it comes back ranging anywhere from just under 500,000 all the way to 3 million years old for a rock that's actually 11 years old. You get the picture here. A lot of it has to do with the system that you use. You don't try to date a 100-yard dash with a sundial, do you? And I think that's kind of what's going on, or at least a rough analogy of it. Going to do it. And when you can test, you see obvious failures here. Most of the time you can't test, you just have faith. One that we probably hear the most about, probably the least significant for evolution because it covers a much shorter period of time, a maximum of somewhere between 30 to 60,000 years according to the evolutionary proponents. Though if you get 30,000 years, I think you have a challenge to what the Bible says, significant challenge. But not significant in terms of evolution. But let's look at the radiocarbon dating system. It works differently, and we won't go in. I used to try to tell the audience how it worked and just bored everybody to death. We won't put you through all that. Let's just cut to the bottom line here. Looking at the Anthropological Journal of Canada by Robert Lee, the troubles of the radiocarbon dating method are undeniably deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged. Now, this is not just something leaking in or leaking out. The underlying assumptions of the system are challenged. It involves the assumption that carbon-14 has maintained the same ratio over a long period of time, and we are learning that simply is not the case. It should have if it's been around more than 30,000 years. But we know that it hasn't. It should be no surprise then, Lee says, that fully half of the dates are rejected. I think that's extremely conservative. I've got a friend that runs the Ball State Lab up in Indiana. The last time I visited with him up there, he was dating a peat bog. He knew it was 20,000 years old. He had dated it 19 times. He was working on the 20th. They'd all come out around 5,000. He knew that it was 20, so he'd chucked all 19. He says, we're going to get a good one yet. It's contaminated with recent materials, his explanation. And so when he says fully half are rejected, I'm confident that's understating the case. But the wonder is surely that the remaining half come out accepted. I think that's a reasonable statement. There are gross discrepancies. The chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are actually selected dates. Again, not science. This is a game. You select the one you want, you chuck the ones that don't come out, and you do more chucking than you do accepting. That you're playing games. We play games sometimes and try to see how it comes out. We've got some going on this week. We don't have time to tell you all about. We'll mention them a little bit later. But this was a piece of wood from the Glen Rose limestone, near where I've been working for the past 15 years, down the Paluxy River. Supposed to be a 110 million year old limestone. And here's charred wood. We sent to the radiocarbon lab at UCLA, or it was sent. I didn't send it. The date came back 890 years old in 110 million year old limestone. Well, about 3 feet away, you see this carbonized stick, which was in the same layer, encased in the limestone. Again, supposed to be 110 million. We sent it to the same lab. It came back 12,800 years, right next to the 890-year-old, all in 110 million year old limestone, which, of course, you would chuck if you were a scientist. I'm not sure that's a good definition of science myself. But this is what you see going on. This is in the same layer is the large ilium bone of an Acrocanthosaurus, a dinosaur that we excavated near Glen Rose. Sent that to the carbon dating lab at UCLA, supposed to be 110 million. It came back 19,000. Well, the scientist says, well, you shouldn't try to date dinosaur bones, you know they're at least 65 million years old. All the carbon-14 would be gone in 40 to 50,000 years. They've been dead for 65 million. You don't even send, well, but let's send it and see. It should all be gone, but it isn't. We've dated over 100 dinosaur bones. Every one of them had carbon-14 in it, and yes, it would be gone in less than 30, 40,000 years. And they all got carbon-14 in it. What does that tell you? I mean, there's a message there, but it's being ignored. I think the absolute dating involves, first, the assumption, as the authorities acknowledge, of a closed system, and we know those don't exist. Petrification helps demonstrate that. It assumes that you know the beginning conditions, and you have to guess at the beginning conditions. It assumes that you know there's a constant rate, and there's serious reason to question the rate of decay. I don't have time to go into that, but that there is really good experimental evidence that's been demonstrated in the last 2 years that the rate has varied dramatically. And when we do know, when we can test, like the lava flowing over the edge of the Grand Canyon and what's down in the lower part of the gorge, when you can test the relative ages, you see the contradictions. There's an anti-creationist at California Polytechnic State University called W.D. Stanfield. He's just hates the creationists, but in his book, The Science of Evolution, he makes an interesting statement. He's, in his fight, has confronted some of these issues and has had some of it sink in. He says it's obvious the radiometric technique may not be the absolute dating methods they claim to be. And that's not something he wants to say. He's been forced to that, and I think you can see why. Age estimates on a given geological stratum may be different by different radiometric methods, or often quite different, sometimes by hundreds of millions of years. There is no absolutely reliable long-term radiological clock. And I think we caught him in the truth at that point. I think that's absolutely correct. So the first answer, radiometric dating, turns out not to be a real good answer. That's not just real good evidence. But let's take a break at this point, see if some of you have some questions, and then another 30 minutes. Who has a question? See, get someone with the microphone over here. Need to get your track shoes on tonight.
I've heard things about carbon dating where they pull something out of like a pyramid and they carbon date it, and it's right on what they say the carbon date was, the Dead Sea Scrolls and all these different artifacts that they know the age, and they say, oh, we got it right on, see, it worked great. Can you comment on that?
How many they've chucked to get that? However, let me take a different tack here. I think carbon-14 can be useful if we're looking at 2 to 3, maybe 4 at the most, 1,000 years. When you go past the date of the flood, everything gets reset, I think. You do have things leaking in and leaking out. You see a scale of departure when you can test, for example, with dendrochronology, the tree rings, which themselves are not absolute, because you can come at 2 different sides of the same tree and get different answers. But pretty close, and you check it with that, and you can see the further back you go, even to, you're not quite as far off at 2,000, a little further off at 3, a little further at 4. Beyond 4, I think you're playing games. But you can have fairly useful data. If you get a number of samples under the right circumstances for a few thousand years, you can get a good idea. But that's not what we're looking at what's way beyond that, and that gets to be foolishness. We have used carbon dating to, you get half a dozen samples under the right conditions, and you know it's not absolute, but you can get an idea of what's going on. And especially when you know they're going to accept it if this is what's put out by a reputable lab, and so we use their own stick to whip them with sometimes. Yes.
Have you heard anything about the million-year-old live geoducks that were dug up and tested by the University of Washington in the last 4 or 5 years?
Yes, and they get real sensitive when you mention examples like that. Clams come out to be 3,000 years old and they're alive. They know that. And they will say, well, yes, you get exceptional situations, but that's not the rule, is their answer. And that's true. But it does show that it's not absolute and not dependable. You do have some very dramatic examples, and really this is what Stanfield is saying. You get wide discrepancies, and especially when you're going for the really old ages. Yes. Other questions? Everybody understood all of that. Okay, why don't we take about a 5-minute break, and then we've got, I think, some really exciting things to show you. We're going to talk about geology, which is what I really enjoy talking about.